The Princess of Vandan. Story by Malika. Narrated by me, Andrew Miller. The last goblin screamed briefly and fell to the floor. Alban stood and stared at its body before sheathing his sword and sitting down, exhausted. The battle against the goblins had lasted for over an hour, and though all of the villainous creatures were dead, he didn't consider it a victory. 3 of his men had died as well. Though they had been by name his servants, they had also been his friends, and he felt more than a little responsible for their deaths. Still, they all knew that this quest would be a dangerous one, and they had been lucky in getting this far in the first place. Now only 3 of them remained. Alban's close friend, Turris, whom he had known since childhood. His squire, Chardon, only 17 years of age. And himself, Alban, 23 years of age, crowned prince of the Elgonite kingdom, oldest son of their king, Mildar, and thus heir to the throne. His father, though old, was still very much full of life, and the prince expected it would be some time indeed before he himself ascended to the throne. But he was in no way eager to become king. In fact, he considered it a very trying job, and he would prefer a life of leisure over the demanding life of a ruler any day. Having already completed his tutoring, Alban began to go on a series of adventures, or quests as he called them. These were mostly concerned with hunting or some other legendary beast, infiltrating and looting bandit lairs, and other similar feats of boldness. He had learned much about combat and bravery during these quests, and had come to depend greatly on the help of his circle of friends, who all enjoyed a bit of action as much as he did. But this particular expedition was quite different, proving much harder than any of them had suspected, and Alban wondered if it would be worth it in the end. They were now in the lands of the Vandanians, a race of giants who were thankfully long extinct, but their castles remained. Though they were now infested with goblins and other nasty creatures, many of them were rumored to contain vast amounts of treasure. And this particular castle seemed in especially good condition, with much of the giant's furniture and other utensils still remaining, no doubt because it was so difficult for others to reach. And as it was told in legends, there sleeps deep within an inner chamber a wondrously beautiful princess, captured long ago by the giants and put under a curse which only true love's kiss could break. Alban used to dismiss such fairy tale legends as being just that. But since he had begun his travels outside his father's kingdom, he had indeed seen many strange and wonderful sights, and he soon decided to investigate each of these rumors, to see if some truth did not perhaps lie behind them. But to return to the present, they had still found nothing but a horde of goblins, which had put up a terrific fight, and now they had lost 3 of their party. Alban hoped there would be no more unpleasant surprises lying ahead, as they had come too far to turn back. He looked at Turris, who gave him a slight nod, and after saying farewell to their fallen companions, the 3 of them headed on. They passed through vast hallways and rooms covered in dust, but still in an immaculate condition. Many rooms were even sealed by enormous doors, and into these they could not go. Eventually, after almost 2 hours of walking, and encountering no more enemies, they reached a room that was even bigger than any of the others. From wall to wall, it may have been a quarter of a mile across. The floor of the room was perfectly smooth, and hardly any dust on it. It was also completely empty, except a small glimmer of light in the center. As the 3 adventurers approached this mysterious light, they saw clearly what it was, and their mouths dropped in astonishment. There, lying on a sumptuous bed, encircled by beautiful glass lamps which were still burning, was a girl. She seemed frozen in time, not moving even a tiny bit. Alban was stricken immediately by her beauty. He had been intimate with quite a few girls before, but none of them had such a great effect on him as this slumbering princess. She seemed to be nearly his height and length, clad in a royal gown of purple and rose, with her hands folded across her chest. Her hair was long and brown, seemed to glow in the lamplight. Her face was young and beautiful, apparently untouched by all that had happened throughout the years. The prince stared at her in wonder, then turned around and saw his companions were looking at him expectantly. "Well," said Turris, shrugging his shoulders, "what are you waiting for?" Alban stared at him for a moment, then began to laugh. "Oh, come on," he exclaimed. "Does this not seem a bit easy to you all? I mean, who's to say she isn't some kind of trap, an illusion or something, meant to lure us closer so that we can be captured?" "Well, if you don't want her," said Turris, stepping forward, "I'll be happy to give it a go." All right, said Alban, still laughing. "I was just being cautious, that's all. After what happened to Lurden and the others." Here his face turned serious. "I just didn't want... Never mind. Besides, if the legend is true, she'll only wake if her true love kisses her. What are the chances that it's one of us who gets to be so fortunate?" He leaned back towards the sleeping girl. Trembling slightly, he approached the bed and brought his face closer to hers. He was no fool. He knew very well that rewards sometimes turn out too good to be for real. But if this was a trap, then they should have all been captured or killed by now. Since nothing of the sort has happened, he at last decided that maybe, for once, the fairy tale legend was real, and that it might have a happy ending this time. He closed his eyes, and as carefully as he could, kissed the princess's frozen lips. But nothing happened. He opened his eyes, but she had not awoken. From behind him he heard Turris laughing, while Chardon muttered something about leaving before it was too late. Alban also felt like leaving, and yet he simply had to try again. Why he felt he had to, he did not know. Maybe there was some kind of magic involved, and it was affecting him too. He leaned in, but before his lips could reach hers, something happened. Something so swift and unexpected he did not have time to even move. The princess began to grow, or rather her body began to expand at an alarming rate. Within seconds the entire bed disappeared beneath her, and the lamps were knocked down and went out. Turris and Chardon only just managed to flee before they too were crushed beneath her growing body. As for Alban, he'd be holding onto her shoulders when the growing started, and he could only hang on as she kept getting bigger and bigger. Pretty soon he found himself on the top of her chest, clutching the fabric of her gown, and he was rising higher and higher into the air. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the growing stopped. Alban found it impossible to believe what he saw. The princess, who a moment ago was just under 6 feet in length, now measured a colossal 150 feet from head to toe. Alban was sitting on top of her right breast, and he was too dumbstruck to move a muscle. He could only watch in amazement as the giant girl came to life. She opened her eyes, then with a gasp, sat bolt upright. sending the now tiny prince tumbling off her breast and landing far below into her lap. Where am I?" she exclaimed, in a voice at once delicate and powerful. "Of course. The curse. It's gone. It's over. My true love has found me. He's come to rescue me. Hey, where is everyone?" "Ah!" came a scream from directly below her. The princess looked down, and it was her turn to be astonished. There, trying to clamber out of her lap, was a teeny tiny little man. He was no bigger than her thumb, and was clad from neck downwards in light armor. He also had a sword, and was swinging it around, trying to hit whatever he could. All he managed to do, however, was tumble around hopelessly. She tried to pick him up, but he stabbed her thumb, which hurt her a little. So she simply pinched his sword and threw it over her shoulder before trying again. This time, she managed to grab him by his waist, holding him carefully between her thumb and forefinger. She held him right before her eyes as he continued to vainly struggle. "You? It couldn't be you," she stammered. "Let me go," Prince Alban yelled, as loudly as he could. "You devil! You monster!" "What? How dare you call me that?" She pinched him harder, and he cried out in pain. "Do you know who I am? I am Princess Valerie of Vandan, and if I wanted to, I could crush you like an ant, you ignorant, half-witted human." "Crush me?" Alban scoffed, trying to sound unafraid. "Is that my reward for releasing you from your curse? If I hadn't kissed you—" "It was you? You? No, it can't be. You're lying. How did you even enter here without being caught? Where are all the people who live here? My family, where are they?" "Why don't you put me down? Then I'll tell you." Valerie sighed and did as he requested. Although she was overjoyed at being released from her sleep, she was starting to get very irritated with this little human. He couldn't have been the one who had released her. It just wasn't possible. Besides, she was also terribly hungry and thirsty. Her head was spinning, and she really wanted to find a soft bed to lie down. The moment his feet touched the ground, the little man ran off like a flash. Valerie yelled at him to stop, but he just kept going. She tried to stand up and follow him, but was immediately overcome with dizziness. She sat down on the hard floor again, looking in surprise at what looked like the crushed remains of a miniature bed. And then, out of the blue, all her memories came back to her, and she immediately understood the situation she was in. She was the youngest child of King Volgar IV, ruler of Vandan. Her elder brother had been the heir to the throne. Of all her family, indeed of all the giants, she alone had enjoyed the company of humans. While her brother liked to torture and even kill human captives, she could not bring herself to hurt the little people, no matter how hard her parents punished her for her abnormal compassion. Eventually, just before her 19th birthday, her father had disowned her, and he decided to punish her for life. He asked his warlock, whose knowledge of sorcery was great, to reduce her to human size, so that she may be treated as one of those she seemed to care for so much. She was to be given to her brother, who no doubt savored the idea of having his weak and pathetic little sister as his tiny slave. But the warlock, though he hated humans as much as any other giant, did not think Valerie deserved such an awful fate. He shrunk her, just as he promised, but he also cast a curse on her and hidden her away. This curse made her fall into a deep sleep, during which nothing and nobody would harm her. She would not age, but would remain immaculate until the day when someone who truly loved her came and broke the charm. It had been 500 years since the day she fell asleep, and her family were long gone. Her people had either died or wandered away, and the castle was empty, except for her, of course. She wandered dazedly through the rooms, recognizing them all. Her own room, through some kind of magic, perhaps the warlock's doing, was still in a perfect state. Her bed seemed as comfortable as it had been when she last slept there. All her clothes looked as if they had been washed only yesterday. There was even a jug of clean water for her to drink, and the fruit in the golden bowl by her bedside tasted as fresh and sweet as any she could remember. After she had eaten, bathed, and rested for a bit, her thoughts returned to the strange little human who claimed to have released her. More and more she began to think that maybe he hadn't been lying after all. And that meant that could it really be? She wondered. Is the man I'm destined to fall in love with a human? I could always ignore the warlock's words, but then what else is there for me? I certainly don't want to spend the rest of my life alone. And besides, I really don't have much in common with my own people. Perhaps I should talk to the human again. Get to know him better. Who knows? In any case, I have to find him first. He's probably miles away by now. She set off immediately, taking with her a bottle of water and a large sack containing fruit and bread. Since she had been a princess, her family had expected her to remain in the castle her whole life, and not venture outdoors much, if at all. This meant she didn't really have any clothes suitable for traveling. So she set off in her royal gown and satin slippers. At least people would know who she was. Or so she'd hoped. The entrance of the castle was in ruins, and everywhere there lay the bodies of men and goblins. Valerie felt aghast at seeing this, but she kept on going. She was a Vandanian, of the most mighty race that ever existed, and she need not be afraid of anything, man or beast. Still, the outdoors was a new experience for her, and she felt she had to remain wary. Around the castle, the giant trees of the forest had grown wild and thick, and as the sun was low in the western sky, she felt she couldn't go much further right now. After a few hundred yards, giant yards, of course, she found a suitably comfortable spot under a tree and tried to go to sleep. She was determined to be up very early the next day. Alban and his companions, after running as fast as they could towards the castle entrance, had quickly mounted their horses and set off into the forest. The horses of their 3 fallen comrades had been set free. Alban had also taken the sword of Lurden, one of his slain friends. Since his own sword had been thrown away by the giantess, he no longer wanted to continue exploring the castle. In his opinion, all giants, no matter who they were fiendish monsters. He had never heard of a sympathetic giant before, and he was fairly certain that this one, fair maiden though she was just as bloodthirsty as the giants he'd heard of in stories. They rode all evening and through most of the night, stopping to rest only a few hours before dawn. In this part of the world, the trees and the grass were as enormous as the former inhabitants, and finding a path for their horses wasn't easy. Eventually, they decided to make their camp under a relatively small bush, making sure there was nothing hiding in it first. They built a fire, cooked some meat from their provisions, and discussed what was to be done next. I say, we head back to Elgon with all haste, said Turris. It's a sure thing that that monster, will come after us. Giants are fond of eating men, or so I've been told. So have I, Alban said. Still, I reckon we'll be safe for tonight. It's just a girl, after all. Who ever heard of a female giant pursuing or attacking men before? It's always been the male ones, I've heard, who do the killing. Well, I still think we better get going as soon as possible, Turris said. I don't wish to be disrespectful, sire, but I'm hoping you'll listen to my advice this time. Very well. We'll rest a few hours, then resume our journey. Chardon, the young squire, remained silent. This was his first adventure outside his land, and he didn't really want to have any more. But he was in his prince's employ now, and he vowed to do whatever his master wished. Prince Alban awoke with a start the next morning. The sun was already considerable height in the sky. They had all overslept, and he hoped that no ill will would come of it. He awakened the others, and they hastily gathered their belongings. There was no time for breakfast. They would have to eat while riding. Alban crept through the tangle of the twigs and leaves for their shelter. The horses had been tied to a twig outside the bush. It had been impossible for them to lead the beasts into the dense shrubbery. But he realized the horses were gone. Alban was shocked, and he quickly saw the reason for their disappearance, and his heart nearly stopped. The giantess had caught up to them. She was sitting right there in that moment, still wearing her royal clothes and eating an enormous pear. And she was looking straight at him, smiling. He turned around at once and rushed back, bumping into Turris and making them both fall over. Back, now, he yelled. It's her, the giant. Hide! He had scarcely finished his words when the shadows around him vanished, and bright light fell upon them. Two colossal hands parted the twigs of the bush far above them, and a gigantic girl's face peered down at them from above. They stood rooted to their spot, hands resting on their sword hilts. The giantess reached down with her hand and easily caught the two of them. Chardon, who was standing some distance away, was trembling greatly. Suddenly he felt very weak and collapsed to his knees. The princess saw him and picked him up too. She put him in her right hand, next to the others. Then she stood up to her full height, holding her hand before her. Alban rose shakily to his feet and drew his sword. He could see the ground almost 40 yards below him and knew it was all over. But if he had to die, he wouldn't die without a struggle. He raised his sword and thrust it with all of his strength into the flesh of her hand. Ow! Valerie cried. The sword had gone deep and it stung. That wasn't very nice. I'm not your enemy, you know. She took the sword out and dropped it on the ground. Then she eyed Turris, who was about to do the same thing. He thought better of it, however, and he put his sword back in his sheath. That's right, she said. I'm not going to hurt you, and I'd appreciate it if you wouldn't try to attack me in return. Now how about a proper introduction? You all left so quickly yesterday that I barely even saw you. Our names are none of your business, giant, Alban yelled. If you wish to kill us, do it now, and spare us from having to hear your wicked voice. Valerie looked shocked for a second, then began to giggle uncontrollably. What? The prince boomed furiously. What are you laughing at? Oh my, she gasped, struggling to control her mirth. You just look so comical, standing there in my hand, fists clenched. I bet you're quite the warrior, aren't you? But you don't have to fight me, little one. This giant won't bite. I promise. Alban sat down, defeated. He resigned himself to the situation, and so did the others. Chardon was looking extremely pale. No doubt he was more affected than Turris, being so inexperienced and all. The giantess gave them an amused look. Well, she said, aren't you going to tell me your names? I am Prince Alban, son of King Mildar of Elgon, and these are my companions, Turris, head of my bodyguard, and my squire, Chardon. We were on an expedition into these lands when you found me and rescued me. A prince, you say? Oh, how delightful. Now I'm certain that you and I belong together. A handsome, courageous prince has awakened me. His great love for me has overcome the warlock's curse. And wait, Alban interjected. Are you out of your mind? You seriously think I'm in love with you? Me, in love with a giant thing like you? You must be mad. But the kiss, Valerie said, looking really surprised. You kissed me, and it broke the spell. That must mean you love me. Otherwise I wouldn't have awoken. And I'm not some giant thing. I'm a person, just like you, even if I am slightly bigger. Slightly? You're a damned mountain. Even the largest, fattest, most hideous ogre is tiny compared to you. And you think we belong together? How moronic. But I suppose that's how you women think. Maybe your men are more sensible. Enough, she yelled, and he froze. Her hand had tightened, and her fingers curled above them like monstrous claws. Chardon took one look at her enraged face and almost fainted. She managed to control herself, though, and without a word, put them down on the ground far below. They looked up at her vast figure and saw how easily it was for her to crush them with one small step. I was wrong, she said, glaring down at them. You're not my true love after all. You're just a stupid, small-brained human who thinks far too much of himself. If I were any other giant, I'd squish the three of you right here, right now. But I won't. In fact, I used to have a high opinion of your kind. But now I see that you are no better than that callous, heartless race which I'm ashamed to belong to. She then reached into her sack and took out a small object, and she laid it at the human's feet. It was a 4-foot-long strawberry, red and ripe, one of the many she'd brought along as food. The men stared at it in wonder. That's just to show you that I'm still willing to be your friend, she said. Besides, I feel I need to give you something to make up for frightening away your horses. Of course, you could always travel with me, but I suppose you find me too repugnant to be near. So I'll be off, and you'll be free of my detestable presence. She turned around and began to walk away. Alban and the others were still rooted to the spot. The prince looked at the oversized fruit lying before him. There was no way any of them would be able to carry it, not without their horses. Without their horses, they were as good as lost. It had taken them weeks to ride this far. Who knew how long it would take to walk back, especially now that they had to carry all their provisions by themselves. Alban looked down dejectedly and wondered if he had made a very big mistake. Just then he heard Chardon's voice behind him. Excuse me, Saya, but shouldn't we go after her? I mean, I know she's a giant and, well, I admit I am a bit frightened of her, but She sounded so sincere. Or so I thought. Maybe, maybe it's not too late. He's right, Tyrrus added. Giants are a cruel, inhuman lot. But there are many men who are like that as well. Likewise, it would seem that there are giants who are friendly to common men, and that this one, this girl, this princess, whatever, she may be one of the friendly ones. Maybe, Alban said. But to be carried back home like helpless babies by a maiden, what would my father, all the people of the kingdom think? No. We'll head back on our own, in a manner as befits a prince and his warriors. Besides, she's probably far away by now. You saw how fast she walked, and chasing after her would be a waste of energy. Come, gather your belongings. We're walking back right now. If I must speak freely, sire, I think you're making a mistake. Thank you, Tyrrus. I'll remember those words once we're back in Elgon. I think it will be quite apparent then that you were the one who was mistaken. Now come on. It's nearly noon, and the road ahead is long and tortuous. End of chapters 1 and 2.